Later on, you did No Man's Land with Seraph.
Well, went so easily. I read it in 40 minutes and rang up at Peter Hall in great excitement. Said, of course, I'm longing to play this part.
Spooner.
And he said, I thought you'd want to play the other part, the posh part. I said, no, of course I don't. And it just happened by chance that I had been in a poetry reading on Sunday night at the Young Vic. And in the same program was Auden. And I saw this man coming down the stairs with a lock of hair over one eye, very dirty, soup-stained suit and awful sandals. And I was introduced to him, and I had known Gielgud for many years. And so I naturally went and spoke to him and said, your friend Chris is a great friend of mine. And he spoke to me very charmingly. And then a few weeks or months later, I don't know how long it was, suddenly this play came into my hands, and I said to Peter Hall, don't you think Auden is the model for this? And I'd never before taken a sort of external subject like that. And so I said, I think the soup-stained suit and the socks and all that. And I went off and got the clothes and a wig and put them on and came on the stage and said, do you think it's all right? And they said, oh, it's splendid, it's marvellous. And I said, well, I was now about a performance to put inside it because I don't know how I'm going to play it at all, but I think it's how you ought to look. And I put the spectacles on. And Peter Hall had very swiftly arranged the moves, which were very few, and sort of blocked the play. And we still had our books in our hands. We had a run-through for Pinter a week after we started rehearsals, and it was already there. It was extraordinary. It was practically ready. Yes, it was a wonderful time. I used to say to people who came around, we don't understand what it's about. And they did the same thing with Home, and I said, what does it matter as long as you had a wonderful evening, which they always said they had. And same in New York, it was equally successful there.
I only worked once with Ralph Richardson for a program on Andrew Marvell, because he loved Andrew Marvell.
Poetry.
And we were talking about acting and so on, and of course we talked about you. And he said, Gielgud does have his limitations. He said, I'll give you an example. He says, suppose that you're at home and the doorbell rings and you open the door and there's Gielgud standing on the doorstep and he says, good morning, I've come to read your meter. He said, you won't believe him. Whereas he says, if I say, I've come to read your meter, you'll say, come on, come in.
One of those big film stars came around to see me in No Man's Land in New York. I can't remember whether it was De Niro or Al Pacino, one of the two. And I said, I'm sure you'd like to read Sir Ralph. And I said to my dresser, do take him, I've introduced him to Ralph. Do tell Sir Ralph who he is, because he'll never have heard of him. And of course, Ralph never had.
So after Spooner, a few years later, all of a sudden we saw you in Caligula. How did that happen?
I was playing in No Man's Land, and Gore Vidal sent me this script with huge letters, Gore Vidal's Caligula, and gold letters on the front. And marvellous part for you, you must play it. And they were offering me the Emperor. And I rushed home and read it. And of course, I was absolutely appalled, and I rang my agent in the morning and said, I can't play this part, it's pure pornography. And they said, oh, well, all right, so they turned it down. And I had a frightfully rude letter from Vidal saying I had assaulted him and I'd never read Suetonius, and it was all quite true, it wasn't pornographic at all. Then I went to do a rather charming film in France, and I was there when suddenly my agent rang up and said, they've offered you another part in Caligula. So I said, oh, I don't believe it. They said, oh yes, it's not at all dirty, or you cut your throat in a bath quite early on, and 2 or 3 scenes, and a lot of money. And it'd only take a week. So I'd advise you to take it. So I rather shamefacedly took it. And then I got into the plane to go down to Rome and found myself sitting next to Peter O'Toole, who had accepted the part of the Emperor, and I didn't know whether he knew I'd been offered it first and turned it down. And I said, I'm not going to play with that Emperor, are you? With that terrible scene in the bath, you little boys and girls coming out from under your skirts. He said, oh, it's old Father Christmas, I don't care. And so we got on like a house on fire, and that was all right. But it was a ridiculous experience. It had even more nudes in it, I think, than Prospero's books, which is saying a good deal. I've now got used to nudity and surrounding me. I even had to take my own clothes off in Prospero's books. Providence was my favourite film. Providence and the film of Brideshead Revisited, when I played the father. which I loved. That was a wonderful part because it was right off the page. And I think Olivier was rather jealous when he accepted to play the other old man. He would have played my part.
For a very long time, I think people have thought of you as an intellectual actor because of Shakespeare, because of the great classics and so on. Would you regard yourself as an intellectual actor?
No, not at the very least. On the contrary, I'm still a very romantic, very childlike sort of amateur. I do think I'm a pretty good professional. But I certainly have no intellectual ambitions, and I can't understand politics or money or power. I've never understood why people want power so much, except that I know when I get into a theatre I have authority, more than I have anywhere else, and that I find rather agreeable. And I can sit there all night lighting a play or rehearsing or whatever without being bored. And I've managed to escape into that world so thoroughly all my life that I've avoided a great many of the most unpleasant things that I've been surrounded by. But now, mostly deaths and illnesses, you can't escape, and eventually death. So much so that I've spent the last 3 or 4 films wondering whether I'd get through the film before I passed out, and what would happen if I did, because it would cost so much to replace me. But I have very great staying power and resilience, and on the whole a very happy and optimistic disposition. But I'm so aware of my faults, my rashness, my impetuosity, my stupidity, and love of being popular, love of being liked, and ignoring things I don't want to look at. But one should face disasters and horrors and miseries, because they're bound to come to you yourself in the end. And I now am aware that I'm so frightened that I shan't be able to face them with any courage. I've always been fairly good in an emergency. My mother, who was a very nervous, highly strung woman, was amazing when she had an emergency. When I went to see her, my brother had suddenly died in Paris, and she took it in the most amazing way. And when she was in the Blitz and so on. And I try and think that my parents' courage, both of them, were very good examples, because I am so frightened of facing reality. And I suppose my love of the theatre does spring from that.
Is there behind it all some kind of belief or a kind of faith or...
No, and I'm not at all religious. I don't believe in afterlife or anything like that. I have no faith, really. That's, I suppose, a bad thing. Once or twice I felt very desperate. But I always feel it's rather shameful to rush off and go down on your knees to God just because you're having a bad time. It's one's duty to kind of face it and get through it. But it's not always easy to do that. I don't really feel I have any knowledge or proper appreciation of the theatre today. And that's why I'm rather glad to be living here and I don't go anymore. And I find it extraordinary to think that I saw every play, films 3 times a week, plays 3 times a week, lived always in the theatre, and I can do without them all quite easily now. And I don't miss them very much. And I read all the critiques, and I go once or twice a year to the theatre as a kind of treat. But it no longer has the absorbing interest to me that I'd had for so many years. And I suppose I had my fill of it. The same thing with parties and gatherings and friends and acquaintances and big do's. I've been through all that. And it's extraordinary to think one's been through it and come out of it the other end.